All right, namaste, everybody. My humble obeisances to all of you wonderful people. Today we will be conducting an interview. Andal Devi is going to have my former great pleasure of interviewing Sri Acharya Ji, and it is going to be a very specific talk. I won't give anything away, and I'll keep this very short, and I will just hand over the floor to her now, and she will be taking it from here. Andal Devi, just please let me know if I can do anything to help.
Okay, thanks, Krishna Prasada. And namaste, Sri Acharya Ji.
Namaste, Andal Devi. It's wonderful being here with you.
Yes, it is wonderful. And namaste, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. We will be doing an interview today of Sri Acharya Ji discussing questions of great importance concerning Sanatana Dharma interfacing with modernity. These aren't exactly questions from the audience, but they are relevant to anyone who follows Sri Acharya Ji and will be very useful and valuable to everyone listening here and to anyone who listens in the future. So let's get started with the questions. So Sri Acharya Ji, can you please tell us how you first consciously began your spiritual journey?
Yes, definitely. And I think the key word is consciously. As far as when I consciously started my spiritual journey, it was certainly quite young. It must have been when I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, something like that, when I began to first contemplate, believe it or not at that age, what was the meaning of life. I understood that everything that took place in this material world was something that was temporary. And indeed, I remember contemplating the fact that everyone goes through these cycles. I remember as a young child thinking to myself, well, what is my future? And I remember thinking how, well, my future is that I'm in school right now, again, having been maybe 7 or 8 years old. And eventually I will go to high school, college, etc. Eventually have a career, get married, have my own children, etc., etc. But then eventually I would pass away. And again, at a very young age, I remember thinking about this cycle, but then also thinking about how it is a cycle that actually every generation goes through. And of course, we always think that we're special, but our parents went through the same thing, their parents, and their parents are gone. That's guaranteed. So it's interesting how, again, I began to contemplate that we go through this cycle, and I remember thinking to myself, is this all that there is to life? There has to be something more. There has to be something outside of the cycle. And that is what got me started consciously to search for truth, is to see what exactly was outside that cycle. And it was at that point that I began, in my own little way, again as a 7, 8, 9-year-old, reading various books about different things, about whatever I could absorb, whatever I could understand, whatever I could get my hands on at the time. So it included even many paranormal sorts of books about, everything from UFOs to ghosts to anything otherworldly, to try to understand, again, what was outside of this cycle that we all go through. And eventually I got to the point where I began to read more serious books. But that's essentially how I began my spiritual journey.
Yeah, wow, that is such a young age. I know you said you read many books quite young. Can you please tell us what inspired you to read the Bhagavad Gita at the age of 10? I know that you started quite young reading the Bhagavad Gita.
Sure, definitely. And the fact that I started young, I was an only child. I was raised in Brooklyn, New York. And as an only child, of course, I didn't have many distractions. Plus, I was always somewhat of an introvert, especially when I was younger. So I just naturally gravitated toward books. But as far as the Bhagavad Gita, well, it got to the point where in my reading of all these various books, I finally realized, well, what is it that I'm actually looking for? This was around the age of 10, very early on when I was 10 years old. And I realized, what is it that I'm actually looking for? I'm looking for the ultimate answer. And I understood that, well, that meant God. Again, not all these trivial things, astral projection and UFOs and this and that. No, I realized I was searching for God. That being the case, I realized also that, well, it's religions that talk about God. And how do you know the various religions of the world? You read their scriptures. So this is what I began doing. I began reading all the scriptures of the world, not all of them obviously, but the major ones. I read the Bible, I read the Quran, I read several other works. But then finally I came across a very nice copy, a paperback copy of Bhagavad Gita that I purchased at a bookstore in New York, in Manhattan actually. And that was when I first read Bhagavad Gita. I must have been late 10, so maybe 10 going on 11 at that point. And yes, I was just amazed by the Bhagavad Gita. The other works, some of them were interesting, some of them frankly were not. They were not interesting at all, some of these religious scriptures. But when it came to Bhagavad Gita, I finally found what it was that I was looking for. I was looking for truly spiritual, philosophical answers. You know, not answers that were just spiritual but made up and new agey and speculative. Not merely philosophy but atheistic and not leading to any conclusions. No, I was looking for the perfect combination of both. On the one hand, spiritual, but on the other hand, truly philosophical. In other words, answers that were universally applicable. And if you had asked me at the age of 10, I probably wouldn't have answered quite with the eloquence that I can now, but that is what I was looking for. So that's what inspired me to read the Bhagavad Gita, and once I read it, that was it. I realized that this was the book, and this was the path that would give me answers, was the Vedic path.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Who were some of the gurus who you encountered immediately after the first reading of Bhagavad Gita?
So immediately after, I encountered several people actually. And again, we have to keep in mind that I was in Brooklyn, New York, and I was, the age range that we're talking about now is roughly, let's say, from 11 to 14, something like that, 11 to 13, 14. So of course I didn't have the opportunity to travel the world, to go to India or Tibet or any places like this. But I did have the blessing of encountering several gurus, even in New York, actually, at the time when I was very young. One of which was an asana guru, actually, Dharma Mitra, and I studied with him just for a few months, not for very long, when I was maybe 12, something like that, and I studied yoga with him, asanas, etc. Soon thereafter, I discovered this other individual who was a very aged Indian yogi / Swami. Swami Bua was his name, and he taught out of his apartment in Upper Manhattan. And it was amazing being there, actually. I remember going there for a little bit longer, maybe 6, 7, 8 months, something like that. I would go approximately once a week or so. And he also was primarily an asana guru. Of course, he was very elderly at the time. He was over 100 years old. So he didn't actually teach the asanas physically himself. He just talked people through. And then there were other people there who actually did the asanas. But he was an amazing individual who I got to know a little bit. The other individual was Prabhupada himself, who, when I was 13 years old, and this is the right word, I encountered Prabhupada. I didn't meet him per se. I didn't have a chance to speak to him, but I saw him from afar, maybe 100, 150 feet away, something like that. Again, when I was 13, and this was 1976. And it was as Prabhupada was arriving at the ISKCON temple in Manhattan at West 55th Street. And I, again, saw him from afar, and he glanced my way as he got out of a car and walked into the temple, followed by many, 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 many devotees singing kirtan. I don't know if we even made eye contact. It's quite possible. But again, I saw Prabhupada in this way when I was about 13 years old. So I've had the fortune of, even then, very, very young, encountering several very interesting, amazing gurus.
Yes, and I think living in a city like New York, especially in the time that you grew up, was really fortunate for encountering gurus. Not a lot of places in the U.S. probably had the availability of authentic gurus during that time period.
It was. I was very fortunate, actually, to have been born and raised in New York. You know, I did have experiences and opportunities that other people in other parts of the country did not. There were Hindu temples there even when I was a child, etc. So yeah, I had tremendous fortune actually to be born in New York, of all places.
Yes. Who was your first initiating guru, and what was your experience with him? He was a Sri Vaishnava, wasn't he?
That's correct. That's correct. Sri Yatiraja Acharya was his name, and I met him when I was 14, and I met him at the somewhat famous Ganapati temple in Flushing, Queens on Bound Street. This was the first Hindu temple that was actually constructed as a Hindu temple. There were temples before then, but this was the first temple to be truly constructed in the Vastu style, Vedic architectural style. But I met him when I was approximately 14, so I guess this would have been a year later, so around 1977. And yes, he was a Sri Vaishnava, he was a Brahmana, he was a priest, he was an Acharya. And I visited this temple, maybe at least twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week if I could. And I did that for several months, maybe 3-4 months, something like that. Not a very long time. But each and every time that I visited the temple, he was there and he taught me. And sometimes I would spend several hours there at the temple. You know, keep in mind, again, I was 14 and then eventually 15. So I was still somewhat young, so I couldn't spend, an enormous amount of time there. But I would definitely try to spend several hours with him. And he would instruct me and instruct me and instruct me. He would instruct me in Sri Vaishnava philosophy. He instructed me in meditation, very deep levels of meditation. He also instructed me in many other things that I can't verbally reveal, just visually eventually. But he also gave me initiation. He's the first individual to give me initiation. He initiated me in the Om Namo Narayanaya mantra, and it was with him that I performed what in Sri Vaishnavism is called the Prapatti ritual. That is, that again, I received initiation from him, having formally surrendered myself at the feet of Sriman Narayana. So that was my first guru, and indeed he was a Sri Vaishnava.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing experience. And I know that Ganapati temple, if I remember correctly, was where the Venkateshwara was. And I know you had a special relationship with the Murti there.
That's right, yes. The first time I went to the temple, actually, again, the very first visit was an amazing experience. And I won't repeat it because there are several videos in which I talk about the power of that first visit to that temple. But yeah, the very first time that I went, actually, I had never been to a Hindu temple before per se, so I wasn't exactly 100% sure, what was the procedure and who everyone was there, etc., because they had many murtis. But they had one murti specifically, and it was indeed Venkateshwara, and it was a little bit smaller. This was a Ganapati temple, so Ganapati was the main murti there. But again, there was a smaller murti of Venkateshwara, who is a form of Narayana, for people who don't know. This is a form of Vishnu. And just intuitively, I understood that this was God. I understood beforehand. I had come to the conclusion earlier that Krishna specifically, and, again, I wouldn't state it this way back then, but I understood Vishnu Tattva was God, everything related to Vishnu, Narayana, Krishna, etc. So understanding that this was Venkateshwara, an aspect of Narayana, I immediately sat there and meditated and in my mind surrendered to him. And this was my very first visit there to this Ganapati Hindu temple. So it was, and that murti is still there. Anyone who lives in New York, they literally can go to this temple and visit and see this murti that I'm talking about of Venkateshwara.
Yes, that's wonderful. You were also initiated by BR Sudarshan Deva Goswami. What were your experiences with him?
Yes, definitely. And in fact, before I even answer that, I should back up a little bit. Practicing Sri Vaishnavism in a formal sense back then as an American was a very difficult thing to do. So of course I was very naturally drawn to Prabhupada, to Prabhupada's teachings, to ISKCON, etc., to the point where I ended up joining the ISKCON temple first in Manhattan, then in Brooklyn, and I lived in several ISKCON temples in the New York area, Long Island. For a little while, there was one in Queens in the early to mid 80s. But eventually I left ISKCON, and indeed I ventured to India to take initiation from the topmost godbrother of Prabhupada. And this was Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Swami. And this was 1985 that I went to India. I went to Navadvip. And indeed, I took initiation from him. I stayed there with him for some time at his ashram. Came back to America. And then a year later, almost exactly a year later, I went back to India, 1986 this was, to again be with my guru. And this time it was a longer period of time. And I stayed there in his ashram the entire time I was there, pretty much. And I took Brahmana initiation directly from BR Sridhar Maharaj. And as far as what it was like being with him, he was truly a Shuddha Bhakta. He was truly a pure devotee. You know, we hear this term, Vaishnavas, Western Vaishnavas especially, we'll hear this term all the time, pure devotee, pure devotee. He was as pure as they come. He was an individual who, as a courtesy to those of us who were in the material world, he stayed here embodied in physical form. But if you were in his presence, it was obvious that he was internally with Krishna 24 hours a day. And when you were in his presence, you felt this. It was tangible. You literally felt that he was in this world just as a courtesy to us, just to teach us. But otherwise, he was with Krishna at all times. And it was extremely powerful. Every single day that I was in his ashram, I was in his presence, I would go there and he would give talks, etc. And I would always be there whenever there was an opportunity. So I saw him pretty much every single day that I was in his ashram, with both visits, both 1985 and 86. So that was my experience with him in the smallest nutshell. I could talk about him, I could talk about any of these gurus actually, almost infinitely, but that was my experience with him.
Yes, definitely an amazing experience. You embraced the Vedic tradition as your religion despite the fact that you were not Indian. Can you please give us some information about your ethnic background?
Sure, definitely. And it's true, I'm not Indian. Sometimes, I don't know how they could, but sometimes people don't know that, actually. But yes, I'm actually of purely Italian and Spanish ancestry. My father was Italian, from Naples, actually. I mean, he was born in Brooklyn, but ultimately his parents came from Naples, the Naples area of Italy. My mother was 100% Spanish. They got together, and it was a good combination, and they had me. So I'm 100% Mediterranean. Sometimes in joking with people, if it gets to be too cold in these climates I've been forced to live in North America, I'll tell people, oh, I've got Mediterranean blood 100%. I don't like the cold. But yes, I'm a person of white European Mediterranean ancestry, and in fact, if anyone pushes me far enough, I'll actually tell them that I consider myself to be quite literally Roman, because on both sides of my family we stretch back to the times of Rome, to the Roman Empire. So I'll actually tell people that I consider myself sometimes to be literally Roman in ancestry. So that's my background.
Yes, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You've been serving in the role of a distinctly American guru since 1988. Over the years, how has the Indian Hindu population reacted to the fact that you are a non-Indian Vedic guru?
Interesting question. It's very interesting. The way I would have to describe this is in this way. It tends to happen in stages. When I first encounter Indian Hindus, at first they tend to be a little bit amazed. I don't want to say shocked, but a little bit amazed that I am, the individual that I am, and yet I consider myself to be fully a follower of Sanatana Dharma, and indeed not only that, but an Acharya, an actual Vedic guru, etc. At first they're a little bit surprised, but that very, very quickly wanes when they get to know me and ask me questions, etc. And then at that point, it's, for the most part, one or two exceptions, but for the most part, complete embrace. I've had mostly very good experiences with the Indian Hindu community, and I'm talking about specifically Indian Hindu leaders, individuals who are a little bit more knowledgeable, etc. So again, at first they're maybe a little bit amazed about the fact that I am an individual who's practicing Sanatana Dharma with such dedication. But then again, they very quickly become very, very happy about the fact that I am who I am, that I am indeed a non-Indian, but that I practice Sanatana Dharma very, very seriously. And again, I've had a lot of support from the Indian Hindu community specifically over the years. That's another thing I can talk about for a few hours, actually. I've had tremendous support from many Hindu organizations, movements, very, very top-level leaders, with some of who have followings in the millions, and they've been very supportive of me over the years, some of whom have written prefaces, introductions to some of my books, etc. So it's overall, it's been a very, very good experience dealing with Indian Hindus.
Yeah, that's really awesome that you've had a great experience with that. It's definitely essential. Over the course of about 10 years, you ended up earning several academic degrees from some major universities, including a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. What was your purpose in following this academic course as a guru?
Yes, the two for me in my mind are definitely coupled. That is, being a guru on the one hand, but also dedicating a good amount of my time earlier in my life to academia. What inspired me to do this was the very fact that indeed my guru, and now we're going back a little bit, again back to 1986, my guru in 1986, BR Sri Dharma Maharaj, told me to be a guru. And not exclusively, many of his disciples are gurus. Bhakti Sundar Govinda Maharaj was the Mata Acharya of my guru's organization, and he's someone who I always respected very, very much. So he was also the guru of my guru's organization. But in 1986, my guru sat down with me, or I should say, I had a darshana with him, and he told me to go back to America and teach them about Krishna and to be a guru. You now be guru, is what he said. You be acharya. So that being the case, I of course contemplated, well, what does this mean? By doing this, I thank God gave me the intelligence to know that didn't mean that, the second I got back to America, start pretending I was a guru when I didn't feel qualified. No, instead I realized that I needed to take a long period of time and make myself qualified. And one of the things that I decided I needed to do was indeed to get a PhD, and specifically in philosophy. Starting in 1986, I knew this was the case, that's exactly what I needed to do. But I began my schooling in 1990, and yes, I ended up getting a bachelor's degree from Loyola University in philosophy, then master's and PhD in languages and cultures of Asia, but focusing on philosophy of religion. And again, it was with the idea, not that I would be a professor or anything like that, but it was with the idea that I would, several things actually. The first thing was that I understood that I needed to now couple my knowledge of Vedic spirituality, philosophy, etc., with understanding the Western world and understanding modernity, very specifically. I knew that this was something which back then, 1986, I was lacking. So this was one reason why I decided to go to college and pursue all this. The other reason was indeed to show the world that I was a qualified individual. That's something that very practically is just very important. There are many people today, of course, who will claim, I'm a spiritual teacher, I'm a spiritual life coach, I'm a guru, I'm a swami, I'm this and that. But they have no qualifications. They haven't really walked the walk. They haven't really done anything to show that they have truly studied, given of themselves, sacrificed, etc. So this is why I ended up doing this. And it's very interesting how at the time, the entire time that I was in college and graduate school, I saw that experience as being almost like my seminary. And that's how I treated it. I treated it as if this entire experience of study was me being, in a way, in a seminary. In Vedic spirituality today, there are very few, if any, what we would call seminaries, places where you can go and study the religion. Well, I made college that for myself. I went through all the paces externally of what I needed to do, going to classes, studying, doing research, writing papers, etc., etc. But internally, as far as I was concerned, I was studying in order to truly solidify my mission in every way. So that's how I ended up going into academia and earning all these various degrees.
Yes, and I know in the meantime you said you were also reading many scriptures in addition to all the schoolwork that you were doing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Yeah, all throughout my life, I always look for any excuse to read the Vedic scriptures as much as possible. So certainly even before I started college, yes, of course, I studied many, many, many Vedic scriptures. And not just Prabhupada's translations. I devoured those voraciously, Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Gita as it is, etc. But more, I read whatever I could get my hands on, Upanishads, other Puranas, more esoteric works, etc. But even in graduate school, yes, when I was there, if I wasn't actually studying for my actual courses or doing research for a paper, I would take advantage of the libraries of whichever university I happened to be at the time. And University of Wisconsin-Madison specifically had a massive library. It's called Memorial Library, and they had pretty much everything. If not in English translation, then in Sanskrit. They had pretty much every Vedic scripture that exists. And I took full advantage of that. So when I was not formally studying, I was reading. And if I couldn't take a book out, because some of these were so rare, you literally couldn't take them out of the library, I would just read them there. If I could take them out, I would happily run home with Grihya Sutras, something like that, something very esoteric that no one's ever heard of, and I would just kind of happily run home and just read and read. So yes, as a result, over the years, I've had the opportunity to read pretty much every Vedic scripture that exists. And it's been a blessing, but it took decades. It's not something that took a year or two. It took literally several decades of my life to accomplish that.
Yeah, I can see it. Definitely so many scriptures out there.
Mm-hmm.
In your own life story, you have yourself personified the interfacing of Sanatana Dharma with modernity, the coming together of East and West, so to speak. Now let me ask you a few questions regarding the interface between Sanatana Dharma and the modern world in recent centuries.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Many people, probably most, have the impression that Sanatana Dharma is exclusively the religion of India and is non-distinct from the nation of India. How accurate is this popular impression?
Yeah, this is definitely the popular impression that most people have. The popular idea is that, oh yes, Sanatana Dharma, Vedic spirituality, what some people would call Hinduism, which is a term that I try to avoid as much as possible. Most people in the popular mind think that this religion and India are synonymous, that this is the religion of India. So you take a 5 millimeter step outside of the borders of the present nation state of India, you cannot be Hindu. you can't be following this religion. I'm exaggerating slightly, but for some people it almost seems that way. No, in actuality, at one time, in fact, the further back you go, what we see is that Sanatana Dharma, Vedic spirituality, actually, as far as even just its geographic expanse, as far as where it was practiced, the further back you go, the further was that geographic expanse. To the point where, yes, what we now call the nation state of India, well, this state was founded in the late 1940s, 1 year previous to its independence. The nation of so-called India included what now is Pakistan, Bangladesh, other places as well. I believe Burma at one time was considered under the British Raj to be part of India. And then the further back you go, again, as far as the religion was practiced at one time by the majority of people, certainly in Asia, within the context of, let's say, the latter part of the Kali Yuga, that is roughly the last 2,500 years, 3,000 years. In fact, I've said this before, and all the evidence is there. There's no human being who has knowledge who would dispute this. Every scholar would agree with this. If you go back, let's say roughly 3,000 years ago, Sanatana Dharma was practiced from essentially what now is Iran all the way to the Philippines. So indeed, at one time, this religion was practiced by a great diversity of people, a great multiplicity of nations, tribes, peoples, etc. So yes, to tie Sanatana Dharma with present-day India is not quite accurate, and it's very limiting. It's very limiting because, again, we're talking about a religion, not an ethnicity. Sanatana Dharma is a religion. It's a philosophy. It's a worldview. So this being the case, it's understandable, I guess, that today some people would equate Vedic spirituality with the present nation of India, because certainly that's where the largest population of Dharmis, followers of Dharma, that's where they are now. But again, if you went back 3,000 years, you would find Vedic temples, you would find Vedic brahmanas, priests, you would find people following Sanatana Dharma from, at the very least, from what is now present-day Iran all the way to the Philippines and everywhere in between. So again, this was a world culture at one point. So yes, it's not quite accurate to equate India with Sanatana Dharma.
Yes, and I think they sometimes phrase it that way because any place on the planet that is Abrahamic now was formerly quote unquote pagan, and we have Hinduism, and that's it. They kind of have a short view of history, and I think that's one reason why people have this view.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Again, it's interesting. I'm known for this. That for me, I equate Sanatana Dharma, or let's say Dharma, not just with what are the overtly dharmic religions of, let's say, again, Vedic religion, Buddhism, etc. But I've actually said that I also include what are called the so-called pagan religions. So let's say pre-Christian European religion. I actually include these in the category of what would be called dharmic.
Yes, and I know that you explained in your writings and talks, like as you were just saying just now, that all the dharmic religions exist within the Kali Yuga have their origin in Sanatana Dharma. Can you please expand upon this historical observation?
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Definitely. Well, it's interesting. By the dharmic religions, in, again, the popular mind, what are spoken of are what I just mentioned a short time ago. So, for example, not just what is sometimes called Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma itself per se, but also Zoroastrianism sometimes, certainly Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, etc. These are what people today, especially religious scholars, will often categorize as quote-unquote the dharmic religions. And the truth of the matter is, of course, every single one of these religions are in themselves offshoots of Sanatana Dharma. And indeed, they began as expressions of actual Sanatana Dharma. What we've seen within the context of the Kali Yuga itself for the last roughly 4,000 years is that at first, again, you had one globally unified worldview. And this is called Dharma, the natural law, the natural way, where again you find this basic concept of there being laws that are inherently found intrinsically within nature itself that can be discernible by human beings, etc. So this basic concept of Dharma, this was at once a global phenomenon. But then what we see is that within the context of Sanatana Dharma itself, eventually within the context of the Kali Yuga, there were several offshoots that took place. First, in Persia, ancient Persia, what today we call Iran, first there was the offshoot of Zoroastrianism. You see, again, at one time, thousands of years ago, Iran was a Vedic nation. They were following the Vedas. They were following Sanatana Dharma purely and perfectly. But then there came upon the scene a great spiritual teacher. Zarathustra is his name. Zoroaster, sometimes people call him. That's the more westernized version of his name. And he started the first offshoot in what then became known as Zoroastrianism. If you look at Zoroastrianism today and how it's been developed over the last several thousand years, You still see many Vedic elements that are there, but you can tell that there are also some differences, and eventually it became its own religion. Well, a little bit later, the same thing happened with Buddhism. And I've stated this so many times in so many different videos. How with Buddhism, at one time, Buddhism itself was a part of Sanatana Dharma. All the evidence shows this, and it's impossible to refute the evidence of this. Gautama Buddha himself was a follower of Sanatana Dharma. He was born in a Vedic kingdom, the Shakya clan, the Shakya kingdom. He was a follower of Vedic spirituality, as was his family. At no point in his life is there any record of him renouncing or denouncing Sanatana Dharma. On the contrary, culturally, religiously, philosophically even, he followed Sanatana Dharma. He was a yogi, he did meditation, he recognized the gods of Sanatana Dharma, including Indra, Brahma, etc. But what ended up happening was that several hundred years after the Buddha achieved Mahanirvana, Buddhism itself, again, ended up as an offshoot of Sanatana Dharma, became its own sect. We then also see this with Jainism as well. Jaina Dharma. With Jainism, the same thing. Rishabhadeva is considered, even within Jainism, to actually be the founder, quote-unquote, of Jainism. Well, Rishabha was always considered to be and recognized as a rishi, in fact, as a chakravartin. He was a king who was also a great yogi. So he was recognized as this within the context of Sanatana Dharma. And this being the case, again, initially, very early Jainism was considered to be just an aspect of Sanatana Dharma, but eventually, very soon after Mahavira passed away, it again became an offshoot, it became its own sect. And then finally we have, in more recent times, meaning about 500 years ago, so, relatively recently, we have Guru Nanak, who is the quote-unquote founder of Sikhism. Guru Nanak was not a Sikh, just like the Buddha was not a Buddhist, etc., etc. Guru Nanak was a Vaishnava, and again, very few people know this, but all the evidence is there, all the historical, literary evidence, etc. It's in his own writings. He recited the name of Govinda, Govinda, this was his mantra. He meditated on the name of Govinda. He visited Vaishnava temples. He visited the Jagannath Puri temple. If you read his writings, they are purely bhakti-oriented and with specifically Krishna and Vishnu as the object of that devotion. So Guru Nanak, the so-called founder of Sikhism, himself was a Vaishnava. But then again, just a few scant, maybe 200 years or less later, Sikhism became yet another offshoot of Sanatana Dharma, became its own religion, and it was specifically Guru Gobind Singh, who was, I believe, the 10th Guru after Nanak, who decided to essentially make Sikhism its own religion. So yes, there have been many, many offshoots of Sanatana Dharma, even when it comes to the overtly dharmic religions. But then I would argue personally, and I have argued, and very few people have even tried to refute me, most people who are knowledgeable agree with me, truthfully, again, all the non-Abrahamic religions that are legitimate, all the legitimate paths, the sattvic paths, the good paths, are really offshoots of Sanatana Dharma in one way or another. And this includes what I would call the pre-Christian European religions, etc. But very detailed answer to your question. I hope that wasn't going too deeply. I could actually go a lot deeper. I'm curtailing myself somewhat.
No, it's definitely very interesting to know the history, and this seems to be a common pattern that the person who started it was sometimes quite different than what ended up being the actual religion. So it's interesting to hear these many different religions that happened to. In
fact, just if you don't mind, just as an aside, let me just also say this, because it's very interesting. You know, I'm someone who I teach the fact that, for example, even Jesus was a Dharma master. He's actually mentioned in the Vedic scriptures. Here is an example that many Westerners can relate to. We consider Jesus to have been a very pure being, but then again, sometime after Jesus, you know, it's arguable exactly when. I would argue it started with Paul. Some people would say several hundred years. what then were his original and pure teachings became warped in what today we call mainstream Christianity. So again, yes, we see this historically again and again, even with so-called Western religions, etc.
Yes. And also on a related topic, just Hinduism as a whole, because we're talking about many different offshoots like Jainism and Sikhism and things like that. But modern day Hinduism is also, you consider it to be a degenerated offshoot of authentic Sanatana Dharma. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Absolutely. And, this has caused a tiny bit of controversy, not really, not much, just among, again, people who are more emotional and less knowledgeable, who haven't actually studied the history of Sanatana Dharma and modern day what is called Hinduism. Again, anyone who is knowledgeable would agree with my assessment of what actually occurred historically. And that is this, that indeed when we look, and this is why I make this distinction between Sanatana Dharma and so-called Hinduism. When we look at the two today, we see that there is indeed a very sharp distinction between the two. Most individuals who follow what they call Hinduism, there certainly are very deep connections, especially culturally speaking, symbolically speaking, language speaking, etc., etc. But then there is indeed a disconnect that is there. And what we have seen is that on the one hand, there is pure Sanatana Dharma itself, and I can define what is meant by that very easily, because Sanatana Dharma defines it, actually. It defines it by the very word Vaidika. Vaidika. If you are an authentic follower of Sanatana Dharma, and if what you are following is authentic Sanatana Dharma, then it is what is technically termed a Vaidika in the Vedic scriptures. That is, that for any aspect of Sanatana Dharma to be considered authentic, it has to be something that is rooted in the Vedic scriptures themselves. It can't be something that's made up. It can't be something that is a compromise to other religions, to history, to whatever is the current thing, etc. Rather, authentic Sanatana Dharma, very simply, is that Sanatana Dharma that is based 100%, again, not 99%, 100% on the teachings of the Vedic scriptures, the rishis, and the authentic bona fide acharyas of the past. So that is Sanatana Dharma. But what we have seen is that in modern times, when I say modern times, I mean, roughly the last 250, 300 years, what we have seen is that as a result of the interface between this pure Sanatana Dharma and then modernity, meaning both the Abrahamic religions, but then also modern materialism, secularism, atheism, capitalism, etc. What we have seen is that as a result of this interface, beginning again roughly 200 years ago, there began to come about a new, and it was very new, and warped understanding of what was Sanatana Dharma. And that led to what is now practiced as modern day quote-unquote Hinduism. And let me explain some of the elements of, again, this warped idea of Sanatana Dharma that is now called Hinduism, just so people can get a clear picture of this. Number one, the idea that many followers of Hinduism have versus Sanatana Dharma is that of what I call radical universalism. I wrote an entire book called Radical Universalism. Does Hinduism teach that all religions are the same? So again, this is something that is rooted in modernity that never existed in Sanatana Dharma up until roughly 200 years ago, in which now many modern day so-called Hindus truly believe that all religions are the same. Doesn't matter what religion you follow, it doesn't matter what your path is, it doesn't matter what you believe even, doesn't even matter what your goal is. If you practice any religion, you will all end up in the same place. Well, that's radical universalism. That's something that Sanatana Dharma has never taught, but that is taught in modern day Hinduism. That's one thing that distinguishes modern day Hinduism from Sanatana Dharma. Another thing is what is called henotheism. That is the idea that, and in fact, let me back up before I even explain this. We know that when you look at Sanatana Dharma, if you have no idea what you're getting yourself into and you first begin to explore Sanatana Dharma, what do you see? You see a myriad of beings. You see gods and goddesses, and they all look different, and they all have different powers, and they all have different names and stations, etc., etc. And it can get to be very confusing for some people. So as a result, some people have taken that confusion to the ultimate degree. Now, what does actual Sanatana Dharma teach about this myriad of beings? It's quite simple, actually. What Sanatana Dharma teaches is a combination of lower polytheism and higher monotheism. In other words, are there many powerful beings in our universe, gods, goddesses, and then other sorts of beings? Absolutely. But they are limited and they are dependent upon that one supreme being, Sriman Narayana, the supreme God, the ultimate Parabrahman. That is what Sanatana Dharma teaches. Now, in modern day Hinduism, unfortunately, they follow what is called a more henotheistic idea of God. And what that means is all the gods and goddesses are interchangeable. Despite the fact that they are all radically different personalities, that they all look different, they have different attributes, different characteristics, different powers, they live for different durations of time, etc., 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 infinite variety and complexity. Despite this, many modern day Hindus really believe this nonsense that, oh, you can just pick anyone that you want and just worship that as the supreme God. And again, this mantra, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as you're quote unquote sincere. Pick any of these beings you wish to worship, whatever strikes your fancy, like picking your favorite flavor of ice cream. Oh, I like chocolate, I like vanilla, I like pistachio. And whatever suits your fancy, choose that God, worship that God, and you'll all, again, like with radical universalism, like all the different religions are the same, you'll all end up in the same place, regardless of who you're worshiping. Well, again, that is modern day Hinduism, we could even call it Neo-Hinduism, versus Sanatana Dharma. Another, and there are many actually, again, I've written about this extensively, there are many other things that distinguish Neo-Hinduism from pure Sanatana Dharma, but this is yet another one, and that is indeed the intimate and inextricable tying together of Hinduism with the nation state of India. So as a result, indeed, we have many individuals in India who they call themselves Hindu nationalists, but they tend to be sadly, and I say this very sadly, they tend to be Indian chauvinists. You know, they tend to be individuals who indeed, whenever I have gotten any kind of pushback from Indians, again, I've explained this, the vast majority of my experience with Indians has been nothing but good. They have been wonderful, open, generous, understanding. They've been wonderful. But whenever I would receive some pushback, it would be among so-called Hindu nationalists, who themselves are indeed followers of Neo-Hinduism, where their idea is being Indian and being Hindu, they're the same. There's no distinction. You know, even if you're an Indian who's practicing Christianity, no, you're Hindu. If you're an Indian who is an atheist, no, you're Hindu. They have taken the idea of Hinduism and made it into an ethnicity and deprived it of its religious meaning. So indeed, when we look at these differences that have occurred, again, roughly 200 years ago, between that eternal stream of Sanatana Dharma and then this concoction that came about due to this interfacing of Sanatana Dharma with, again, many modern concepts, many concepts from the West, from Abrahamism, from, again, pure atheism, Marxism, etc. What we've seen is that we can pretty much almost say that modern day Hinduism is another offshoot of pure Sanatana Dharma. Now, they are still closely related to the point where it's my hope that in the future, individuals who call themselves Hindu will eventually reform themselves and re-embrace actual Sanatana Dharma. That means re-embrace what their scriptures actually say. That is my hope. But as of right now, indeed, there is a distinction that people need to recognize. And we need to recognize it because if we don't, we will not be able to practice pure Sanatana Dharma. We will not be able to understand it, and therefore we will not be able to save it from its present predicament and make sure that it endures into the future. So I hope that, does that answer the question?
Yes, it definitely does. Thank you for the answer. And also, on a related note, we discussed a little bit before about pre-Christian European religions, such as Asatru, or any other pre-Christian or pre-Islamic religions that are also considered dharmic religions. And a few other gurus have focused on, connecting all of these dharmic religions. As a result, you also have an enormous audience of followers from pre-Christian European religions. Why do you consider paganism to be dharmic? And we also discussed this before, but if you can expand a bit on it.
Definitely. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I am one of the first Vedic gurus of any kind, of any sort, of any sampradaya or anything, who has reached out very, very much to followers of pre-Christian European religions. And what are those religions? You mentioned one, Asatru, so basically Nordic paganism. I'm just going to use the word paganism. Some people don't like that word, but most people are fine with it, most of the practitioners. This means, again, followers of Nordic paganism, followers of Slavic paganism, of Celtic paganism, of Roman paganism. But then there are a few others as well, so Lithuanian, Latvian, etc. So again, all of the pre-Abrahamic, pre-Christian religions of Europe. Yes, I'm one of the first gurus, Vedic gurus of any kind, who has systematically and very consciously and purposefully reached out to these people, recognizing them as indeed brothers in Dharma, brothers and sisters in Dharma. And the reason why this is the case is because I've studied them extensively. And I've studied them in their pure form as much as is possible. Again, much of the information has been lost, sadly, due to much of it being destroyed, much of it just being forgotten, etc. But I began studying pre-Christian European religions, again, decades ago, before I even started college, actually, because I was fascinated by all these various religions, the Druids, etc. And one thing that I saw is that in the practices, in the worldview, the connections are so close and so profound as to practically recognize these as, again, just different aspects of Sanatana Dharma. So I always recognized this. But then again, in recent years, meaning, roughly the last maybe, dozen years, 15 years or so, I have really focused on this, again, more than any other guru probably alive on the planet today, in several things. First of all, reaching out to followers of pre-Christian European religions, the paganisms, helping them to understand the connection that is there between their ancient religions and Sanatana Dharma, the Vedic religion, helping them also to understand their religion better in light of Vedic knowledge, and also, again, trying to bring about closer connections in understanding that what they are following is Dharma, but it's European Dharma. It's natural law. There is no European pagan on the face of the earth who would say that they are not respecters of natural law. On the contrary, they would all agree that natural law is foundational to their religious practice. And what is wonderful is that, of course, in Sanatana Dharma, natural law is in the very name of our religion. Dharma means natural law, the natural way, etc. And as a result, we have been able to help many tens of thousands, actually, of pagans in Europe, in America, many, many different places, to more deeply understand their own religion. And the reason why is because, just very practically, as we know, in Europe, the pagan religions were decimated. They were battered for 2,000 years by the incursions of Abrahamism, of Christianity especially. So as a result, they have very little that's left. There are almost no temples. Whatever temples are there are pretty much modern. Whatever books they had, whatever scriptures they had are gone. Many of the practices, many of the philosophical understandings, etc. So what we have been able to do is to help many of the more, let's say, pagan leaders and scholars and intellectuals and actual religious leaders to reconstruct and restore their own religious paths with the knowledge of Vedic spirituality. But indeed, we see, for all these reasons, the pagan religions of Europe as being non-distinct from Sanatana Dharma, just with less knowledge. And again, not their fault. God knows, not their fault. Again, these religions were battered for close to 2,000 years. So as a result, they've had to reconstruct. So they may not have the same, let's say, knowledge base, practice base, etc., the same copious amounts of scriptures that we do in Vedic spirituality, but nonetheless, we see them as indeed extensions of Sanatana Dharma. And, we have been very fortunate in Sanatana Dharma, whereas the pagan religions, they lost almost everything, or I should say it was taken away from them. It was burnt away from them in some cases. Whereas in Sanatana Dharma, we have everything. Everything. We have all of our Vedic scriptures intact, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, enough that you could spend half your lifetime reading the Vedic scriptures and never have to repeat a book. We have all of our practices intact. We have all of our lineages carrying the knowledge down from guru to disciple to guru to disciple, etc., etc. So we are very fortunate in Vedic spirituality that whereas in, again, the paganisms of Europe, they have little bits and pieces here and there. One tradition might have 2% of what was actually there originally. Another one might have 10%. Greco-Roman spirituality still, of course, retains quite a bit, actually. But even there are tremendous gaps of knowledge that are just there. There's knowledge that's missing. So, but with Sanatana Dharma, we have 100%. So it is I see it as our duty, and it's certainly our privilege to help our brothers and sisters in pre-Christian European religion to fill in those gaps. And indeed, we have been helping in that way. And it has been very, very humbling that I know for a fact, and it's been the case for years now, that I and the International Sanatana Dharma Society, we have an enormous and supportive audience of tens of thousands of people from these communities who they watch our videos, they read our books, they support us in so many ways because they also recognize that we are brothers and sisters in Dharma, in natural law. And that has been enormously humbling for me, and I look forward to these relationships only deepening.
Of course, and this is really essential work, and as you were saying, we're really fortunate to have the tradition, the Vedic tradition and Dharmic tradition still alive to some extent, to a large extent, to where we can fill in those gaps. That's definitely very fortunate.
Mm-hmm. It is.
You also make a very sharp and irreconcilable distinction between all Dharmic traditions and the traditions of Abrahamism. Why do you see Dharma and Abrahamism to be at such odds with one another?
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And let me say, I'm not the only person to have seen this. I'm not even the first person to have seen this distinction, actually. I have to admit that right up front. Indeed, many people, even previous to me writing about this, saw this distinction. Of course, the further back you go in time, it was less and less. That knowledge has increased more and more as time has gone on. But yes, indeed, I've written about this maybe more extensively than anyone and spoken about this more extensively than anyone. And that is that, yes, when you look at, let's call this the ocean of religion today, the world of religion today, with all the various world religions and sects and denominations, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is, you can look at all these religions, thousands of them, and you can very easily place each of these individual religions into one basket or another. The one being Dharmic and the other being Abrahamic. And again, as far as the Dharmic religions, I've already spoken about that. It includes not just what are overtly called the Dharmic religions. So again, Sanatana Dharma, let's say Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Jainism, Sikhism, not just these, but all of the pre-Christian European religions, the pre-Christian religions, let's say, of North Africa and many other places, etc. That all falls in the one basket known as Dharma, the Dharmic religions, the religions that believe in natural law. These were the eternal religions that worked in cooperation with nature, that worked in in a way that they tried to produce harmony among all the diversity that they saw within this world, etc., etc. They tried to follow the natural law. The other basket is what is called Abrahamism. And in that basket, first, for those who don't know, let me just list what falls into that basket. It's much more limited. It includes Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Baha'i. The Baha'i faith falls squarely into this category. But then I go a little bit deeper in my writings, and I also include Marxism, philosophically and as far as mood and worldview and philosophical origination. Marxism is Abrahamic. And then going a little bit deeper, what we would call, it's tiny, but that's all right, what we would call modern day Luciferianism or Satanism also is Abrahamic purely. So these are the two baskets. These are the two categories in which these religions fall. Now, what makes them two different baskets? Why are they considered to be two radically separate religious entities, religious phenomena? Well, the reason why is this, that again, previous to Abrahamism, the entire world pretty much, I'm sure there were a few exceptions. If there were, I have not found them in my studies of the last 49 years. With maybe very few exceptions, at one time the entire world was united in the idea of Dharma. Again, the idea of there being natural law. And I'm not going to go deeply into what I mean by that because extensively in all my talks and books I go very deeply into what's meant by natural law. But then, interestingly, what occurred was early on within the historical context of the Kali Yuga, the Kali Yuga having started a little bit over 5,100 years ago, we had something that both spiritually, metaphysically, but also ideologically and philosophically was what I call a rupture in history. And that is that 4,000 years ago, there was an individual named Abraham, so thus Abrahamism. And Abrahamism is not a term that I made up. It's an academic term that's found everywhere. You can look it up. Abraham came upon the world scene, again, roughly 4,000 years ago. He himself, or I should say, ostensibly, let's say, he came from Vedic heritage himself, because he came from the city of Ur, which is in Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia. And we know for a fact, looking at just the objective evidence, that was a Vedic city. Again, the city architecture was built in accordance with the Vastu Shastra, etc., etc. That was a Vedic city. So this individual was exiled, I believe, along with his family, their slaves, etc. There were roughly 90 of them. From the city of Ur, they went westward into the Levant area, the Levant region, into what now is called Palestine, Israel, etc. And what ended up happening was Abraham himself encountered a being in the desert there. This being is described variously as El, as Yahweh, etc. And this being created a covenant, a deal, a pact with Abraham. And again, I'm not going to go too deeply into this because I've written extensively about this. You can just look at my books for much more detail. But essentially, this being in the desert, metaphysical, disembodied desert being, made this pact with Abraham that if you and your people, your descendants, worship me and me exclusively as your God, I will give you all that your eyes survey. I will give you this land, this Levant area, what again some people call Palestine, some people call Israel, etc. I will give you all this. I will give prosperity to you and your sons and your sons' sons and your posterity, going on as long as this pact continues, etc. So it was the first business deal, in other words, a mercantile exchange between a metaphysical, disembodied being and a human that we can discern historically. This is what occurred. But more than this, it's not just the very nature of again, this pact, this covenant that took place, but what was introduced into the world at this point, again, as I call it, a rupture in history, was a ideology that had never existed before. It was an ideology that now saw itself as being quite literally in a war to the death with everything that had preceded it. That is the natural way. That is the natural world order. Vedic spirituality, but more than just Vedic spirituality, again, Dharma itself. So indeed, in all of its philosophy, worldview, Abrahamism is the opposite of Dharma. And again, I won't go too deeply. If a person wants to go very deeply into what we're talking about, in the Dharma Manifesto, a book that I wrote, I go much more deeply into breaking down exactly what is the Abrahamic worldview. But let me just say a few things. First of all, Abrahamism sees itself as radically exclusive. In other words, you either are a follower of Yahweh or you're not. And if you're not, you're in trouble. If you're not, you will be forced to be a follower of Yahweh. Something like this had never existed before. So the concept of religious war was born with Abrahamism. There were wars of religious people, but that's different than a religious war. In other words, a war waged on the part of one religion toward another with the idea that we will conquer you to convert you. That had never existed in the world previous to Abrahamism. Now with the birth of Abrahamism, we have this concept of warring in the name of religion. Also, there is the concept in Abrahamism of what I call conflict theory. Virodhavardhanavada is the Sanskrit term that I literally created in order to explain this theory. Sanskrit is a living language. If you have the ability and if you have the expertise to do so, you can come up with new terms, just as long as you know what you're doing and you're authorized to do so. I came up with this term, Virodhavardhanavada. This is one of the foundational principles, you could say philosophically, of Abrahamism, and that is the idea of growth through conflict. The idea that conflict is a good thing and disharmony is a good thing, because what will happen as a result of conflict, disharmony, is that something greater will come about. Of course, practically speaking, we've seen that the opposite has always been the case for the last 4,000 years, but this is something that Abrahamists very much believe. This is why they engage in so-called holy war, in jihads. This is why in Marxism, which again is an extension philosophically of Abrahamism, you have the idea of dialectical materialism. You have the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis that was taught by Hegel, but then taken over by Marx. The idea that indeed conflict is good, class conflict, racial conflict, conflict between the genders, and as a result of all this conflict and pain and suffering, something wonderful will come about. Well, this is something that the Abrahamists teach, whereas all followers of the natural law, again, whether they are European, whether they're Indian, Asian, whoever they are, we believe in the idea of harmonization of opposites and harmonization of the diversity that we see around us. We believe in the idea of, indeed, Dharma being natural law, human society should replicate nature. In the same way that when you go into a deep forest, you see the diversity that's there of all these various everything, trees and foliage and flowers and animals, and you see that even though they're all different, somehow they create this harmonious whole. Well, in Sanatana Dharma, the idea is that we should do that socially as well. And when we do, there's peace. And we have the evidence of hundreds and thousands of Vedic civilizations, city-states, tribes, peoples, etc., in the past who followed this dharmic principle, and it did work. It did produce peace. It did produce harmony and happiness and prosperity and health, etc. So indeed, we see this radical distinction between Abrahamism and Dharma. And the two cannot be reconciled in any way whatsoever. They cannot be reconciled. It's like trying to reconcile fire and ice. You can try, but you'll end up with neither. So yes, indeed, this is something that, again, while I'm not the first person or the only person to recognize this distinction between Abrahamism and Dharma, I am the first person to write about it and speak about it as extensively and as deeply as I can, and to analyze it as deeply as I can, to the point of getting to the very root of what makes Abrahamism tick altogether. So I hope that wasn't too extensive of an answer, but it's actually the short answer.
No, it's definitely very interesting and very important information. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
And So, Sanatana Dharma, as we know, is a religion that is not just a belief system, and it has has a strong level of, practical solutions for us. And a lot of people think, Sanatana Dharma also is relegated to the past. What are practical solutions that Sanatana Dharma offers us today?
Sure, definitely. And again, this is also another area in which myself, but also our movement, the International Sanatana Dharma Society, is quite unique. And that is that, yes, we recognize that, let's say, the Vedic tradition, Sanatana Dharma, while certainly spirituality and religion is at the very foundation of it, it is not something that pertains only to these things. It's not something that pertains only to religion, only to spirituality, philosophy, etc. But in actuality, what is wonderful is that Sanatana Dharma is a civilization. And with everything that means, with all the paraphernalia, all the accoutrements, all the fields, etc., of what it means to be a civilization. So does Sanatana Dharma have tremendous, amazing teachings to offer us spiritually and philosophically? Of course. But more than this, it comments on every single aspect of the human experience. What this means is Sanatana Dharma has enormous things to teach us politically, as far as quite literally politics. And when I say politics, I don't just mean historically. What were the politics of Vedic cultures 5,000 years ago? No, I mean politics today. As of right now, it's 2023. How to engage in successful politics today. It means talking about economics. It means talking about science. It means talking about every aesthetic field, from just trivial entertainment, or let's say more trivial entertainment, to deep aesthetic culture and beauty and the arts, etc. And on and on. Again, all the sciences. There are Vedic rishis and great gurus who wrote about biology, who wrote about medicine. We have our own entire medicinal system known as Ayurveda, which is a medicinal system. It's vast. There were Ayurvedic physicians doing surgery 2,300 years ago, and truthfully before then. That's one of the earliest evidences that we have, is going back around 2,300 years ago, and on and on. So indeed, when we talk about Vedic culture, Vedic civilization, certainly for most people, and especially Westerners, what they're attracted to is very specifically the more spiritual aspects of Vedic spirituality, of Vedic culture, Vedic civilization. And that's understandable. That's what first draws people in. People want spiritual answers. But the truth of the matter is, we're talking about a civilization with everything that entails, quite literally architecture, how to arrange your city streets in a way that is most pleasing, etc., etc. So yes, all this being the case, as far as what Sanatana Dharma has to offer us today, I'm not going to go too extensively, because, again, to go too extensively, we would need about 5 hours. Let me just say this. Every single problem that we have today can be solved by looking at the various fields of Sanatana Dharma. This is what is wonderful, is what we are missing today is precisely this. We have our own sciences, we have our own ideas of urban planning, city architecture, our own ideas of gardening, our own ideas of cooking and medicine and healing and herbalism and astrology and philosophy, etc., etc. But they are today deprived of God. They are deprived of the spiritual. What Sanatana Dharma has to offer us today is a way of being in which we can have all of the benefits of having a truly advanced civilization with all the material comforts and prosperity and health that we want and that we need today, while at the same time coupling that with the fact that what is being practiced as that civilization is purely spiritually based, and that is also based upon natural law. So in other words, I'll just pick one example of, again, thousands that I can choose. We have our own medicinal system. We have our own medical system, the Western medical system that we know of, where we are prescribed drugs for every single illness that we have, where surgery is always the answer, etc., etc. There's no preventative maintenance. doing things the natural way doesn't exist, etc. We have our own medicinal system. It works all right, but it basically works on helping people with their symptoms and just keeping them alive a little bit longer rather than working on the quality of their life and actually curing them, healing them. Well, in Vedic spirituality, in Vedic civilization, we have, again, our own medicinal system. It's known as Ayurveda. And it also heals, but it heals deeply and it heals naturally and it heals without bad results, without any sort of new ailments coming about. So what do we have to offer? This is only one example. With Ayurveda, we have ways of healing people that heal the whole person, that truly heals them, that heals them naturally without having to ingest them with synthetic drugs, etc., that will ultimately end up hurting them. And this is just one of, again, thousands of examples that I can give. If individuals today were to begin to tap into this knowledge that has been there since the beginning of time, and that is still here, and begin to follow all of these fields of knowledge, of human knowledge, but in accordance with the Vedic understanding, Vedic knowledge that's already there, our entire world would be benefited. Our entire world would end up being 100 times more advanced than it is, and naturally so, without any artificial creation, any unnecessary pain on the part of people, etc. So if we, in other words, were to follow the teachings of what it means to create a Vedic civilization, we would have a true civilization in which it would be what I would call, and I didn't coin this term, it was a French philosopher, it would be a type of archaeofuturism in a way, in which it would be the perfect coming together of the ancient dharmic teachings of the past, the time-tested teachings of the past that were there, that were understood, that were practiced, that were enjoyed by myriad dharmic civilizations. It would be the coming together of that with the best of modernity. Because, I need to stress this, that with modernity, the idea is not that we reject all of modernity. We reject the poisons of modernity. But we accept much of the technology. We accept the good things that have come about. Right now we're using all sorts of technology so that we can have this interview, for example. Well, here's an example where we're taking the best of, again, modernity as far as technological inventions, but we're using them in a spiritual way for a higher purpose. So the vision that we have of the future is, again, a coming together in which we don't reject who we are as peoples, whether we are whatever, American, French, Spanish, Italian, German, Russian, etc. We don't reject who we are. We do reject the poisons that have arisen in our society in modern times. But we embrace fully who we are, but we also incorporate all of these astounding teachings that have been there since the beginning of time, known as Sanatana Dharma, in such a way that we perfectly integrate the two. This indeed is our vision for the future. I hope that answers your question.
Oh yes, and then of course it's an extraordinarily beautiful vision of reality and the future that we'll have. And this is a harmonization, and it goes back to what you were saying, that is the opposite of Abrahamism, the harmony of, the diverse elements of civilization and our technology and all the beautiful things, and with God as the nectar nourishing society. So it's definitely a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. Definitely.
So how would Vedic philosophy assess the many materialist ideologies of modernity, such as Marxism, liberal democracy, capitalism, feminism, atheism, etc.?
Well, to state this bluntly but simply at first, but then I'll go into some depth, these would all be categorized as Abrahamism, because they all arose in Abrahamic cultures. Again, Marxism itself is something that I have said is an offshoot of Abrahamism, because if you look at the philosophical thread that you find throughout the development of the Abrahamic worldview, it extends into Marxism. Marxism simply being, let's say, the philosophical zenith, if you could call it that, or the depths. Abrahamic philosophy. So we would categorize that into Abrahamism. But then also everything else that you mentioned as well are certainly elements of modernity that Vedically we would reject. Feminism, for example, we see as a type of crypto-Marxism. Now, on the one hand, it's interesting. Let me talk about that for a moment, because I have spoken about this extensively, and I've written an actual book about this called The Shakti Principle. When it comes to the idea of the feminine, we have a concept of the feminine that is extremely highly advanced. And that is that we understand what is meant by the very nature of the feminine, to the point where we understand that power itself is considered to be something feminine. So we understand, for example, that when it comes to the supreme Godhead, God has both masculine and feminine attributes, etc. And as a result of this, we have enormous respect for women. And women have respect for men, men have respect for women, on the one hand. On the other hand, the excesses of modern feminism, whether first, second, or third wave, or whatever waves there will be in the future, we see as, again, an artificial and unnecessary extension of Marxism that is not designed to help women, really. In fact, what we've seen is that women have been harmed tremendously in the last 50, 60, 70 years. But rather, it's designed to, again, create conflict between men and women. And this goes along with, again, what is Marxism? What is Abrahamism? Conflict theory. The idea of finding diversity that's there and making all the individual components, all the individuals of that diversity hate each other. So this is what we've seen. So indeed, we see modern feminism as something that is indeed one of the degenerative excesses of modernity. As far as atheism itself, again, atheism is something that especially arose as a reaction to Abrahamism. Atheism was not really a serious phenomenon. You had a small smattering of individuals who were non-theistic, who were atheistic, etc., in dharmic societies. But they were so few and far between as to not even be worth speaking about historically and academically, and that's been the case. But rather, atheism as a concerted effort to see itself as being opposed to religion and spirituality, this you see very specifically in the Abrahamic world, as one could say almost a natural opposition to Abrahamism that was then taken too far. So in other words, even in Abrahamic societies, many intellectuals, many intelligent people saw the problems with Abrahamism, but sadly their idea was to then, kind of do the opposite. We want no religion now. So again, atheism as it presently exists is more of a modern concoction and a reaction to Abrahamism. It's not a reaction to Sanatana Dharma. It's not a reaction to any of the other dharmic religions, whether Taoism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism, any of the pre-Christian European religions, etc. So atheism, given what I said, I personally would put in the category of Abrahamism, because it is a reaction to Abrahamism, and it only exists and has meaning in that context of a reaction to Abrahamism. So indeed, we see many, many problems with modernity ideologically that we are opposed to. We are opposed to socialism, both politically but also economically. Interestingly, we are also opposed to capitalism, and especially the idea of capitalism as it exists today. And that is free markets, not just in the localized sense, but this artificially expanded idea of free markets, meaning that corporations, however big they are, have the right to continue growing, even despite the fact that they may be harming people by the multiple millions, they may be harming the environment, they may be harming the world itself, etc. We are opposed to capitalism as well as socialism on the economic front. And I can go on, but again, I speak about all of this much more extensively in the Dharma Manifesto. But does that answer your question somewhat?
Yes, it does. Thank you for your answer. One of the hallmarks of modernity has been a very high degree of depression, mental anxiety, dissatisfaction, and other forms of mental illness. How would Sanatana Dharma help to alleviate the current pandemic of misery in today's world?
Very, very good question. And let me say, generally speaking, all of these mental and emotional illnesses, maladies, etc., came about with the birth of secularism. There is no one who can look at the situation objectively who would disagree with this. It is as a result of growing secularism, that is, with the idea of religion dying, of religion no longer having a place in society, in the schools, in culture, etc., that increasingly we've seen this correspondence of there being, yes, depression and sense of meaninglessness and hopelessness and all sorts of mental disorders that have arisen. So this is true just in general, that indeed, if we want a society that is more mentally healthy, well, have a religious society. Again, there is no study, no research study that has not upheld this fundamental fact. But then when it comes to Sanatana Dharma very specifically, Sanatana Dharma is equipped to help with such emotional and mental trauma more so than any other religious path on the face of the earth. And I don't say this lightly. The reason why I say this is because indeed we have the technology of mind. It's called yoga. And in yoga, what we understand is precisely how it is that the psyche itself works, and how it is that the psyche can become warped as a result of various forms of cultural poisoning and propaganda that will affect an individual's psyche. But we also understand how to cure that psyche. And the way that that is done is indeed through yoga itself, and specifically the meditational practices of yoga. So meditation itself, but then also breathing exercises that can help to calm the nerves, calm the system, etc., that can help the individual to know themselves deeper and deeper to the point of having tremendous self-discovery and being able to come to a point of eventual healing, emotionally and mentally as well. So indeed, we have the technology that has been there since the beginning of time that can help us to both analyze the situation, understand why it is that today so many people are experiencing the debilitating mental and emotional illnesses that they are, but then more to also help them to overcome those and in a positive way. So indeed, this is something that increasingly the International Sanatana Dharma Society is doing more and more, is that we are also emphasizing the healing of people today. So many millions of whom have indeed been traumatized by one or another aspect of modernity that indeed has harmed them to the point where now they need very deep healing. And the ISDS is increasingly more and more using these various techniques to indeed help people. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes, it does. And yes, that's wonderful and definitely needed in the world today.
Very much.
If a European or American, let's say, wishes to become a dedicated follower of Sanatana Dharma, how much of their native cultural expressions and customs would they have to give up? Would they have to stop being Westerners and begin to act like they're from India?
Very good. That's a very good question, actually. Again, this is something else that I am known for speaking about, and the ISDS also operates in the way that I'm about to explain. First of all, let me answer this in reverse. If a person is a Westerner, and again, anywhere from Europe, America, Latin America, if a person is generally speaking a Westerner, they're British, they're Irish, they're from France, Germany, Russia, Spain, etc., Portugal, any of these nations. And of course, they already have their native culture, their native way of being, native foods and dress, etc., music. To become a follower of Sanatana Dharma does not mean that they need to leave that all behind and now imitate an Indian from India. No, that is not the case in any way, shape, or form. Now, what we've seen is that for the past roughly 140 years, give or take, what we've seen is that for many Westerners, unfortunately, they didn't quite get this, and many of them did indeed, again, seeing Sanatana Dharma and India erroneously as being synonymous. Many of them did kind of do that and had the idea that, oh yes, what it means to be Vedic now is that I need to dress like an Indian, I need to eat only Indian food, I need to start watching Bollywood movies, etc., etc. And no, that's very unfortunate that they thought that that was the case, because it's not. Indians presently today, they have a wonderful culture. India is a wonderful place. It's a place that is growing in every way imaginable. So I don't want people to think I'm denigrating India ever in any way. No, India is on the verge of being a superpower, and I'm proud of them, actually. It's wonderful that that's the case. But all I'm saying is that Westerners who are not Indian, so people like myself, who have this idea that by following Sanatana Dharma, they're following a quote-unquote foreign religion, foreign culture, etc. No, this is not the case in any way. And not only do you not need to give up your native Western ways, the ways of Westernkind, not only do you not need to give those up, on the contrary, you can celebrate those and express those to the ultimate degree as much as you wish, while at the same time following Sanatana Dharma. So indeed, the way that we do things is quite different. People will often see my videos where, for myself, of course, I will often dress like a Vedic priest, like a Vedic guru. I will be wearing kurta, dhoti, etc. I'll be wearing, various sorts of clothing like this. But people will also see me wearing a suit and tie. People will also see me wearing a jacket. People will see me wearing clothing that are easily recognizable as Western. And this is because I try to live what I teach. I encourage all of my students to indeed celebrate their ethnic culture, regardless of who they are. Again, they can be Russian, they can be Italian, they can be anything. No, speak your native languages, celebrate your culture, eat your foods as long as they're vegetarian. And with almost every single cuisine on earth, you can have vegetarian options. But at the same time, while looking like a Westerner, you can be following Sanatana Dharma. So indeed, this is not something that is quote-unquote foreign to Westerners. We're not asking people to give up who they are. On the contrary. Oh, we don't want you to give up who you are. On the contrary, we want you to discover who you are. And what that means is in every way. That means retain your own culture that has been followed by your ancestors, by your parents, their parents, their parents, stretching back thousands of years. Celebrate who you are. Celebrate your ethnicity, your people, your culture, etc. But at the same time, understanding that Sanatana Dharma is precisely that. It is the eternal natural way. It is the religion, the spiritual expression of our very cosmos itself. That being the case, you can be a French follower of Sanatana Dharma. You can be an Italian follower of Sanatana Dharma. You can be a Spanish follower of Sanatana Dharma, a British follower, a Welsh follower, an Irish follower, a German follower, a Swedish follower, a follower of Sanatana Dharma from Iceland, etc., etc., etc. I can't mention every single nation or people. But indeed, it's not necessary, not only is it not necessary to abandon your people's ways and become Indian, quote unquote, but on the contrary, the Sanatana Dharma in cultural expression, in civilizational expression that we envision for the future, is one in which individuals will be following Sanatana Dharma philosophically and in practice, and in some cases also culturally, when it is truly steeped in actual the Vedic scriptures, perfectly on the one hand. On the other hand, they will be driving cars, they will be using technology, they will be eating the foods of their people. Again, I'm half Italian. I love Italian food. I'm never going to stop eating Italian food. I also like Indian food. I also like Thai. I also like many other forms of food. But no, our vision is individuals who are following Sanatana Dharma perfectly in philosophy and practice, while at the same time looking modern, looking like their people, dressing in suits and ties if they so desire, etc. Having artistic expressions that look Celtic, that look Nordic, that look Germanic, that look Roman, etc. Roman columns, Roman architecture, absolutely perfectly fine to incorporate and to integrate into this future Vedic civilization. So indeed, we're going to bring about the best of all worlds. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you for that beautiful answer.
My pleasure.
And then you said many times that in the Vedic tradition is not the religion of our past, but it is the religion of the world's future. We already touched on this a bit more earlier in the interview, but what will Sanatana Dharma of the postmodern era look like? What is the Sanatana Dharma of the future?
Very good. In a way, I just answered that without anticipating the question, I guess. Yes, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be the best of all worlds. What is Sanatana Dharma inherently, in practice, in practicality? It is being our best. Let me talk about this for a moment, just philosophically. What it means to be a follower of Sanatana Dharma. A dharmi, that means literally a follower of Dharma, an Arya, a noble individual. What this means, among other things, is that as individuals, but then also as a society, we seek excellence in all things. And that means all things. That means we seek excellence first and foremost in ourselves, in who we are. We make sure that we have brought the good that we are in every aspect up and out to the maximal degree. It means that we are healthy. It means that we are beautiful. It means we are intelligent. It means that in every way we bring ourselves to the very best that we can be. But then also, again, with everything, with our environment, with what we create, but also with what we do spiritually, etc. So this is what it means in general to be a follower of Sanatana Dharma. That is, we celebrate excellence, not mediocrity, but excellence. Not excuses, but excellence in everything. That being the case, we also have the ability to recognize the best that is around us. So again, the idea of Sanatana Dharma in the future is one in which we are going to extract the very best of what modernity has to offer us. That means most of the technology, not all of it, some of it is demonic, but most of the technology. That means much of the science, not all of it, because again, some of it is demonic, but some of the science. Indeed, we will retain some of what is there in modern medicine. But again, only the best, only that which truly makes sense and can be provable to actually heal people, and merge that as a little subset of what is actually natural healing, and on and on. I go into every single field. And this is the point. What we are going to see in the future as far as Sanatana Dharma is we are going to see individuals who are practicing Sanatana Dharma, but also using their cell phones, also using their computers, also using transportation devices, let me just call them that, cars, airplanes, helicopters, etc., but much more advanced than what we have today. Indeed, there is this idea that some people have that Sanatana Dharma is Luddite in nature, that is, it rejects technology. That's not true. Indeed, we have evidences from the Vedic scriptures themselves that thousands and thousands of years ago in the previous yugas, especially in the Dwapara Yuga, but also other yugas as well, we had individuals in Vedic culture who quite literally were traveling in airplanes of their time. So indeed, we don't reject technology, but we accept only that which is the most natural and the very best of technology that will actually help the people. So what is the Sanatana Dharma of the future? Several things. Again, it is this coming together of Vedic civilization itself as it has been there since the beginning of time, but also with whatever modern inventions and ways of being that we've seen that are beneficial. It will be a Sanatana Dharma of multiple Vedic dharmic nations as well. People know that, for example, our YouTube channel is called the Dharma Nation channel. Our Discord server is called the Dharma Nation Discord server. And I've written a very book called The Dharma Manifesto, where I speak about how to create a Dharma nation. Well, in the future, we are going to see a world in which there will be hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, not just the roughly 200 nations that we have today, but multiple hundreds, maybe even stretching into the thousands, of Dharma nations, in which indeed every individual and distinct people and ethnos, they can celebrate who they are as a unique people, but at the same time, the entire world united in worldview, and that is through Dharma, with the idea that indeed we are all distinct. We have our different languages, we have our different, again, ways of being, cultural norms, etc., foods, but at the same time we are all united in that we recognize that the way to have happiness and prosperity and health is via this phenomenon known as Dharma, that is the natural way of the cosmos itself. So this is what we envision as far as the future of Sanatana Dharma. We envision a world, the grandeur and the advancement of which is very difficult for most people to even conceive of today, but which nonetheless we are going to bring about.
Thank you. And we definitely look forward to that future. Sounds wonderful and beautiful.
It will be.
Yeah, so this concludes all the questions for the interview. Thank you, Sri Acharya, for this wonderful interview, and it's been a pleasure to interview you today. It's always a blessing to hear your wisdom.
Very good. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for conducting this interview, Andal. I truly appreciate it, and you did a wonderful job. You're a professional interviewer in every way imaginable. So thank you so much. And it's been my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. And I also hope the audience enjoyed the interview. And thank you for everyone who showed up to listen. And namaste, everyone, and namaste, Sri Acharya.
Thank you so much. Namaste. Jaya Shriman Narayana.